Evolution explains the features of all organisms, from single-celled microbes to multicellular humans. Evolution is considered to be descent with modification, or more specifically, changes in heritable traits from generation to generation. Recall that a population is a group of interbreeding organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Evolution occurs in a population when allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. We can calculate allele frequencies with the following equation. We simply count the numbers of copies of an allele and divide that number by the total number of alleles for the same gene in a given population. Evolution is detectable by examining our population's gene pool, which is the entire collection of genes and alleles in our population. Even for the same species, such as humans, gene pools differ from population to population. The gene pool for a population living in Sweden differs from a population living in San Mateo. If Swedes migrate to San Mateo and interbreed with the locals, then allele frequencies in the gene pool will ultimately change. Technically, evolution has occurred when allele frequencies change. When we're studying for our exam, make certain you can describe how evolution acts only on populations and not on individuals. To help us understand how evolution works, let's look at a historical perspective. And this information is not necessarily directly in your textbook, but we do need to understand this for the exam. In about 1801, the scientist Lamarck and his contemporaries suggested that organisms changed over time, but they really didn't understand how this occurred. And one of the animals that really perplexed them was the giraffe. The giraffe has such an oddly long neck, and they couldn't understand how over evolutionary time an animal could come to get such a long neck. So what they thought was a giraffe stretches its neck, and slowly over time that neck gets longer. So here we can see a little comic. The mama giraffe is saying, "Stretch, stretch, think about the children." And the baby giraffe is stretching, trying to reach closer to the trees. This is not how evolution works. The way that Lamarck was describing the giraffe would be considered an acquired trait, and these acquired traits cannot be inherited. For example, if you plant a seed from a tiny bonsai tree, that tree will grow up into a full-size tree, not into a bonsai. The only reason the bonsai tree stays so small is because it acquires these miniature characteristics because a human has to carefully cut them and prune them and keep them in a small pot. Another case in point, consider if a female weightlifter has a baby. Is she going to give birth to a buff little muscular baby? Of course she's not. She's going to give birth to a regular baby. That little baby would have to work out and lift little baby dumbbells if it wanted to get little baby muscles. So next we're going to learn a little bit about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was the naturalist on the HMS Beagle, a ship that sailed around the world in the 1830s. He spent a lot of time on the Galapagos Islands, which are just off the coast of South America. His time on the Galapagos was especially influential in helping him develop his evolutionary thoughts. For example, Darwin described 14 different types of finch, each different from birds on the mainland and yet sharing similar features. In particular, it was beak shape of these finches that varied, and this beak shape was specific to a special type of food that was found only on these unique islands. The Galapagos Islands is a chain of 100 different islands. It's not just one or two different islands. Darwin thought that these 14 finch species had probably descended from a single ancestral type of finch. Pondering the great variety of organisms in South America and their relationships to fossils and geology, Darwin began to think that these were clues to how new species originate on our planet. In 1859, he published his thoughts in the book On the Origin of Species, and in this book he described a process called natural selection, which was become to be known as the mechanism of evolution. Natural selection is defined by two different parts. Number one, organisms alive today descended from ancestral species. And number two, natural selection is the mechanism for descent with modification. In this picture, we can see some layers of rock in the Grand Canyon. And in these layers of rock, we can find fossils, which are the remains of formerly living organisms. Fossils of extinct species, in particular, can suggest that living organisms are descended from common ancestors. Darwin made two big observations in forming his theory on natural selection. Number one, there is a big overproduction of offspring in nature. Many organisms produce way more offspring than the environment can support. For example, here's an example of a puffball fungus that produces millions of spores. Each spore can grow into another puffball, but of course not all of them will actually germinate. A second observation is that there is a tremendous degree of individual variation. When we think about things like ladybugs, which are technically referred to as Asian lady beetles, these beetles have a big variety of the spots and the colors of their wings. Darwin's inference, based upon these observations, is that natural selection must involve some differential reproductive success. More specifically, some individuals will have more offspring than others due to environmental factors. In natural selection, environmental factors truly cause this differential reproductive success of individuals with particular genotypes. And these genotypes are simply the collections of genes and alleles that are found in these organisms and in these populations. So back in Darwin's day, we didn't understand how DNA worked yet. But now we can update our analysis to describe DNA. DNA can undergo insertions and point mutations and deletions, and these can change the language of the DNA molecule. They ultimately change the phenotypes of organisms. It's not going to always change the phenotype, but it's possible to change the phenotype. Natural selection truly acts as a sieve. Lots of phenotypes go in, but only the successful phenotypes come out. That is to say, natural selection is going to be a selection for different traits in different environments. Here's a question to ponder. Here's the lizard man with all of his tattoos and piercings and body modifications. Will the lizard man have lizard kids? Are his traits acquired or heritable? Consider why or why not. In addition, consider these questions. Why is heritability necessary for natural selection? And what would happen if a trait wasn't heritable? You can see both of these questions on your screen, and I hope you will consider them as you study for the exam. Humans can artificially alter allele frequencies, and when we do so, we refer to this as artificial selection or selective breeding. Even back in Darwin's day, lots of humans were doing artificial selection as they were breeding different types of crops, for example. In artificial selection, a human chooses the desired features, then allows only the individuals that best express those qualities to reproduce. Much subsequent research has corroborated and expanded on Darwin's finding. As we look at this timeline, it shows us how different scientists have made different advances in understanding how evolution plays out among all of the organisms on our planet. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe how artificial selection is different from natural selection. This organism is a type of insect, and it blends almost perfectly into a leafy background. In fact, we could say that this insect looks like a leaf. How could an organism like this arise? Each generation, the best camouflaged individuals survive to reproductive age. That is to say, if organisms can't see you, they can't eat you, and you have a better chance of reproducing. The alleles that therefore gave you this camouflage become more common in each subsequent generation. It's very important to note that natural selection does not create these alleles. The alleles must already be there. They must arise by chance. And instead we would say that natural selection strongly selects for camouflage alleles. Natural selection operates on variation that is already present in our population. Remember, natural selection doesn't make these traits appear. The alleles must already be present. Remember back to our two-part definition of natural selection. Individuals are often more than an environment can support. Therefore, there's often a struggle to survive. Next, we can define evolutionary fitness. Evolutionary fitness is a measure of an organism's ability to both survive and reproduce. It's simply a measure of how many babies you can successfully make. Some individuals in a population are going to be better than others at making offspring. The heritable traits conferring these advantages are what we define as adaptations. Adaptations are features that provide a selective advantage because they improve an organism's ability to both survive and reproduce. As a case in point, here are some bacteria. Bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics have an adaptive trait that the non-resistant bacteria do not have. Therefore, when we put antibiotics into the bloodstream and those bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics are present, those resistant bacteria will be strongly selected for. However, again, it's so important that you understand that antibiotics themselves do not create a resistance allele. The variation in resistance was already present in the population. The presence of antibiotics caused the resistance allele frequency to simply shift in this population of bacteria. Evolution never stops. As the environmental conditions change, populations' phenotypes will be favored at different times. Adaptations that seem perfect in one environment would be completely wrong in another. This orchid flower and its specialist wasp pollinator have evolved alongside one another for long enough that no other animal can pollinate this flower. But the orchid does not evolve in order to be better pollinated by our wasp. Neither the orchid nor natural selection has any foresight. Instead, the orchids best suited to wasp pollination are the most likely to reproduce. So therefore, their alleles get passed on to the next generation the most often. Evolution does not have an end goal. Here's a question to consider. Ferns require moisture to reproduce. What will happen to a fern population during a prolonged drought? Your first choice is to save the species. Some of the ferns will acquire the ability to reproduce without water. And your other choice is, if none of the ferns already have the ability to reproduce without water, the ferns might go extinct. Pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer yet. And the answer is, if none of the ferns already have the ability to reproduce without water, the ferns might go extinct. Remember, changing environments cannot spontaneously make alleles change to give you a selective advantage. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe how natural selection may favor different phenotypes at different times. Here's another thought question. A population of grasshoppers in the Kansas prairie has two color phenotypes, both green and brown. Typically, the prairie receives adequate water to maintain healthy green grass. Assume a bird that eats grasshoppers moves into the prairie. How will this affect natural selection of our grasshoppers? And your next question to consider is, how might this change in a drought year? Natural selection can shape our populations in many different ways. For the exam, we need to memorize 3 modes of natural selection, and we're going to look at these one by one. We can distinguish the effects of these modes by looking at how they affect a phenotype in a population. The first type is directional selection, in which one phenotype is favored over another. On your screen, there is a graph that shows us that over time, the dark phenotype of moth is favored because the habitat in which they live got darker due to pollution. So therefore they camouflage better with their environment, and they're less likely to get eaten by birds, and therefore more likely to reproduce. In disruptive selection, the extreme phenotypes are favored over the intermediate. So in this example, we have a big earthquake, and all the rocks change in a given environment. Now, instead of being all one color rock, there's light rock and there's dark rock, but there's not a lot of medium colored rock. So therefore, the snails that have a light colored shell or a dark colored shell are favored over the medium colored shell. And in our last example, we have stabilizing selection, in which an intermediate phenotype is favored over the extremes. In this example, we show human babies that have special pigments in their skin, and these pigments are controlled by different types of proteins. Now, if babies have too little or too much pigment, then they're not very healthy. But if they have just the right amount of pigment, they're very healthy. However, these 3 models do not explain why natural selection would maintain harmful alleles in a given population. One explanation for why some harmful alleles would persist in a population is referred to as the heterozygote advantage, in which a heterozygote is favored over the homozygotes. For example, heterozygotes for the sickle cell allele do not have sickle cell disease and are protected from the blood-borne disease malaria. But if two heterozygotes mate, their child might have sickle cell disease. When you're studying for the exam, make certain that you can distinguish among all three modes of selection. Sexual selection directly influences an organism's reproductive success. At face value, building a complex nest, flashing your showy feathers to your mate, and butting heads with another male might seem to waste energy. So how could this waste of energy persist in these populations? How can natural selection allow for traits that apparently reduce survival because they take a lot of energy? Sexual selection is a type of natural selection resulting from variation in the ability to obtain mates. Sexual selection results either from competition for access to the other sex, for example, the rams butting heads, or from one sex choosing attractive mates of the other sex. For example, generations of choosy females have selected for males with nest-building traits or elaborate ornamentation. Though this yellow weaver bird uses lots of time and energy to make this elaborate nest for the female, this behavior might secure a mating opportunity because choosy females want to choose a male that can build the best nest for them. Here's an excellent video on the lyrebird. I can't play the video due to copyright reasons in this movie, but please find it on YouTube and check it out. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe 2 ways that competition for access to mates can lead to sexual selection. The final part of this lecture is going to explore some of the other ways that evolution may occur. Other factors change allele frequencies over time besides mutation. And the other ways we can change allele frequencies is by genetic drift or migration. Genetic drift occurs purely by chance. In the example in our textbook, it shows us a jar of marbles that has 50 orange marbles and 50 purple. If we randomly sample 10 marbles and then restock the jar according to the ratios from our sample, you can see that in just a few short generations, we can lose all of the purple marbles and have 100% orange marbles. By chance events, it's possible to lose these alleles and therefore change our population's phenotypic ratios. Genetic drift only happens in very small populations simply due to statistics. One type of genetic drift is called the founder effect. When only a few individuals establish a new population, the allele frequencies might change over time. This process illustrates the founder effect. For example, Amish American populations are found in many places in the United States, but they're very concentrated in the states of Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Amish populations tend to just interbreed with one another. And one of these strange traits that we see in the Amish American population is presence of extra fingers and toes. Here's a baby that has a 6th extra finger. A population bottleneck is another type of genetic drift. Bottleneck effects occur if a disaster drastically reduces the size of a population. If we have a cheetah population with 25 different alleles that are represented by 25 different colored marbles, and then we place those into a bottle, and then we pour out just a couple of these marbles, now we've gone from 25 to 3. But the reason that the population is drastically reduced is because the habitat is lost for the cheetahs. When we repopulate with just a few cheetahs, our genotypes are completely different because only 3 alleles remain. And if these cheetahs by chance don't have these traits they need to survive changing environments, they could go extinct. Here we can see a cheetah range map from National Geographic. It shows the former range was all through Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East, but currently it's much, much less. Now we just have a few small places that they still live, unless we can change our catastrophic human-induced habitat loss. The last way that we can change allele frequencies is by migration. Migration moves alleles between populations. For example, this little white bunny hops through the meadow and interbreeds with the brown bunnies. This migration might affect the allele frequencies in both populations. Migration moves these alleles between populations. Here is a map of the North American waterfowl migration, and it shows these huge populations of birds that move through our continent, thus moving their alleles with them as they reproduce. Our final challenge question of this lecture is: only the observable phenotype is subject to natural selection. Is this true or false? Pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer. This is false. It's not just about the observable phenotype when we're talking about natural selection. You must consider the genotype as well.